Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways. Hello there, Al Murray here. Just before this episode of We Have Ways of Making You Talk gets going, I just wanted to let you know that this is in fact our 700th episode of the podcast. All those years ago when James and I got going on this, not for one moment did we imagine we'd still be doing it all this time later. But it's really thanks to you, our listeners, for lending us your ears that's enabled us to get to episode 700 and to be still bursting with more ideas and more interesting things to talk about in the War Waffle setting. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this, episode 700.
Acton. Welcome to We Have Ways to Make You Talk with me, James Holland, and with John McManus in St. Louis, Missouri. And we're joined today by a very special guest, a former soldier and paratrooper. Is that right, James? James Fenelon.
That's right.
And also, latterly, an author and historian. And you write, James, about those forgotten airborne heroes. You know, we all know about Easy Company, we all know about the 101st, and we all know quite a lot about the 82nd Airborne, but we don't know so much about the 17th Airborne. And you wrote about them in that in 4 Hours of Fury, all about the crossing the Rhine. And then one we're talking about today, which is my new heroes, the 11th Airborne, Angels Against the Sun. And that's such a great title because, of course, the sun is Japan and the Angels was the nickname of the 11th Airborne. Anyway, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on. And just before we came on air, we were looking at your man cave, which, you know, I thought mine was good, but geez, yours is just absolutely off the radar. It's fantastic. Amazing. It really is. You've got old posters, bric-a-brac, stuff, other frame pictures on the wall. There's an 11th. Oh, look at that. Yeah. You're just tilting your camera so we can see it. I mean, it just looks absolutely amazing. 11th Airborne helmet, all the kit that any person who's afflicted with this subject of World War II would be most envious about. But anyway, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, James.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. And of course, you know, as you guys know, so much of history is not tactile. So one of the things that I love to do is to visit locations and, of course, surround myself with things that kind of remind me of the period. And I'm fortunate to have a place to put some of it.
Well, you know what? John and I were talking about this just a couple of weeks ago, and I am very much in the same camp, and I know that John is too. Despite the kind of sterile university walls behind him. That's horrible. You need more stuff and helmets.
It's just my computer is pointing in the wrong direction. You're not looking at my bookcase. Oh, my God. I mean, it's almost like yours, Jim. I mean, it's like...
Okay. I just haven't had the glimpse of it. But I so agree with you, James, because I think it is really, I mean, cracky, on this show, we bang on and on and on about the importance of walking the ground, and it just so is. But also, I do think it makes a massive difference being able to kind of hold a Garand in your hands and know what it feels like, what it smells like, what it's like to handle, and all that kind of stuff. And you're right, these things that remind you of the era that you're writing about. I'm looking at the moment at an Australian style of Cobra. I'm looking at 2 early war RAF flying helmets and various other stuff. And it's just that little tactile link, isn't it?
That's right. It really just helps kind of bring things into focus. And to your point, especially when you're handling a World War II weapon, and then you as a writer, you add your imagination into that as best you can around what it would take to actually do that under stress, in the dark, in the rain, etc. It just kind of adds to that storytelling.
Well, and for this particular topic too, I mean, you couldn't have any better base point of understanding than to spend a dozen years as a paratrooper yourself, and to be, to be a pathfinder and and obviously know the airborne world. And I really do think that it comes across in your books, particularly in Angels Against the Sun, of understanding the mindset of the 11th Airborne Division, who these guys were. They're in a way, they're just your predecessors. I mean, you're a paratrooper through and through. And so you have that base point, but you're like us in the sense of being a nerd historian too, who loves to immerse in that world. So that's what I loved about the book, is that you can kind of bridge that gap that sometimes exists.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of the things I remember when I was a younger paratrooper, one of the first sergeants in my unit, we happened to be looking at a picture of a Pathfinder stick from the 82nd Airborne going, those famous pictures there in front of the C-47s before they were going into Normandy. And he made this offhanded comment. He just said, the names change, but the faces stay the same. And it really was the first kind of time that I realized that I could, with some humble pride, connect my service to those guys that had actually done the real deal back in the 1940s. And that's kind of what started my interest in looking into those forgotten airborne units, because all their stories, in my opinion, are worthy of being told. And some of them, like the 11th Airborne, have very unique experiences. And by unique, I mean from an airborne perspective. Certainly the 11th chewed a lot of the same ground and fought a lot of the same enemy as other units in the Pacific. So I don't want to take anything away from those experiences. But from when we look at the 11th from an airborne perspective, they were the only airborne division on the American side sent to the Pacific theater. And so they do have a lot of interesting experiences that I think are worth remembering.
Yeah, I mean, just before we get on a little bit more onto 11th Airborne, how many sort of parachute drops have you done?
I've done 74 military jumps.
Wow.
Which frankly is not a lot. I mean, there were guys that had a lot more than I did, but I am thrilled to say that one of those jumps was out of a C-47 into the drop zone near Ranville in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. So that was an exciting...
Were you kitted out in full British Denison smock, or were you in your normal kit?
I was just in my normal kit, but the stick in front of us was all decked out in the Denison smock and the helmets and everything.
Oh, well, that must have been quite a privilege, wasn't it, to land on Ronville?
That's exactly how I look at it, Jim. It was a privilege to get to again, that inside. It was funny. We came out over the coast and we're coming back in for the drop, and there was just one Higgins boat coming in as part of the commemoration. But it was just kind of, I was like, okay, there's actually, imagine dozens of them, So it was a fascinating experience to get to do that.
So were you interested in all this first and decided to become a paratrooper, or did you get interested, during your days as a paratrooper?
A little bit of both. I was certainly familiar with the World War II history at a very high school level type of thing before I enlisted, but it was actually the service of my uncle, who was a paratrooper in Vietnam, that got me interested specifically in that aspect of it. And then when I was at Fort Benning going through jump school, I was 18 years old rather, didn't have a lot of money, didn't drink, so spent a lot of time on post and went to the museum there on post one weekend. And that's when I started reading about the 17th Airborne Division and the jump across the Rhine. And it
amazing.
I hadn't heard of that before, and it just kind of stuck with me. And so that was, as I continued my career, and then after I got out and started going deep into learning more about the history, it was my desire to learn more about the 11th and the 17th that then subsequently inspired me to write the books about them.
Out of curiosity, was your uncle in the 173rd Airborne Brigade?
He was actually in the 9th Infantry Division. And so he was what they called a shake and bake back in the day, where he had enlisted, went through non-commissioned officer school. And I think as part of him going through the NCO Academy, they tacked on jump school. He wasn't actually in a jump unit in the 9th Infantry Division, but he had gone through that and kind of regaled me with all the stories of what that was like. That was back when jump school had a building painted yellow for all the dropouts that had to go. They don't do that anymore, but it was, it was kind of a big deal back then.
James, I think, it'd be great to get you back on to talk about the Rhine, but today, I mean, let's focus on the 11th Airborne. So John and Al and I were having a chat a few months ago about the 11th Airborne and Corregidor and Joe Swing and stuff. But we kind of touched on it really, rather than kind of going into any detail. But tell me a little bit more about the 11th Airborne, how they come about, how Swing, because he's the first commander, and he's given the job of forming them, isn't he? And explain how they got to be. And you were saying earlier on that, they were they had a particularly unique story. So, I mean, it'd be good to, I'm just fascinated by them. I just think it's so interesting that they were doing this amazing stuff in the Philippines and elsewhere, and kind of, we know so little about them. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, I think you brought up a great point there with Joe Swing kind of forming the division, because that's the reality of how it happened. It wasn't a situation where he was assigned to an existing division. The 11th was one of a handful of divisions that kind of went through basic training all at the same time. Now, there's a slight exception there with the 511th, the Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was formed slightly before the division. But basically, Joe Swing, when he was assigned the commander to form the division in February 1943, really got to put his stamp on the way the division was trained from the very beginning, which I think you'll, as they go into combat, you really see kind of how that unfolds. One of the things I found really fascinating about Swing was he wouldn't fall into the category of what I would call one of the original or the OG airborne guys, meaning that he was a one-star general in charge of the 82nd Infantry's artillery unit when they started converting into the airborne units. And so he kind of came at it from a very different perspective than, say, James Gavin. And Swing viewed it very much as just a unique commute into the battlefield. And I think he recognized some of the shortcomings of that early on in the division's training. So I think it's important for everybody to understand one of the big differences between airborne units back in World War II was, that the 11th Airborne had about 8,500 guys in it at full strength compared to a regular infantry division, which was around 14 or 15,000 guys. And so, that manifested itself in different ways.
Well, it's because you haven't got all the guff that goes with an ordinary infantry division. You haven't got all the ground stuff. You haven't got the heavy lift or anything like that. The whole point is they're supposed to be kind of like, but also but the battalions themselves are smaller, aren't they? The companies are smaller. Is that right?
That's right. Particularly in the glider infantry regiments, those were smaller units as well. And I think, one of the unique things where I started to really kind of develop an affinity for Swing was seeing how in basic training, he was known for going around all the staff buildings and making sure that nobody was sitting around doing paperwork while the guys were out in the field training. Because
God, if only today was like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Less paperwork. But James, just go back to Joe Swing, because he's a really cool guy, isn't he? I mean, isn't he on the punitive expedition to Mexico in 1916, and I think then he goes out of France, doesn't he? I mean, he's in that kind of fairly elite band of Second World War generals that has seen action in the First World War, that has seen combat action elsewhere, such as the punitive expedition to Mexico. I mean, along with George Patton. I mean, he's another on that in that exalted company. So he's been around the block, and he stayed in the army. He stayed in the kind of peacetime between the wars army, which obviously is tiny and quite hard to get on with and everything. But he's stood out from the crowd for some reason, hasn't he? Well, what is it about him that's kind of got him into the situation that he's going up the ranks once the war breaks out?
I think it's great that you brought up the punitive expedition into Mexico, which was 1916. He had graduated from West Point as an artillery officer in 1915, so it was one of his first assignments right out of the academy. And I feel like that had a tremendous impact on his career and the way he viewed warfighting, because you can argue about the success of the punitive expedition, but what makes it really interesting from a U.S. Army perspective, it was the first time that the Army was really experimenting with the integration of new technology. So it was the first time they're moving troops with vehicles. They've got motorcycles for, message delivery. They've got a handful of biplanes that they're using for scouting missions. And so it's important to remember that when they're doing all this, they don't have any doctrine, they don't have any field manuals, because they're in the process of actually trying to figure out how this is all going to work together, right? This is right before the U.S. got involved in World War I. And so Swing becomes, at a very early point in his career, very comfortable with this idea of improvisation, quickly identifying what's going to work and gravitating towards that quickly as possible in order to be successful, in this case in the campaign and later in the war, of course, in his battles in the Philippines. But he also learned through that experience a number of cautionary tales, which I think you'll appreciate, Jim, given your penchant for the operational art, is, with all these trucks and everything, they would break down. They didn't have spare parts readily available. They'd run out of fuel. They didn't have gas, at hand. And so Swing saw this as a young lieutenant, along with George Patton. And I think you can see that when the 11th gets committed up into the Philippines, and that small size could be viewed as a detriment once they're up on Leyte and on Luzon, that you see his comfort with not only improvisation, but his foresight around supply and logistics that really helps propel the division and keeps them punching above their weight. And I think all that kind of comes back to the foundation that he got along the United States-Mexico border as part of that initial campaign.
Well, and career-wise, too, he's married Peyton March's daughter. Peyton March is, I think, Army Chief of Staff. And he writes him these fascinating letters during World War II that are in the Swing papers at West Point. So Swing is colorful, but he's also descriptive. He's perceptive, and he's certainly kind of a doctrine geek, too, on some levels as well. And so he's had an influence in sort of the reappraisal airborne operations after the Sicily drop and all of this. And so I'm curious, James, what do you think about the influence of Peyton March on Swing's outlook as a soldier, as a mentor in a way?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, John. He worked for Peyton Marsh. That's, of course, when he was his aide, and that's when he met his daughter and then subsequently married her. And I certainly think that, as anybody who has exposure to, let's just say, a next level of leadership or a next level of thinking, it certainly does a great job in propelling you to think in ways that maybe you previously hadn't been exposed to. So I don't think we should underestimate that exposure as well, right? Him not only marrying into the family, but also working for the chief of staff certainly provides you with a perspective that you wouldn't normally have as if you were a captain or a major in an artillery unit.
Well, of course, because if you're a junior officer, you might be informed about the bigger picture, but really all you're witnessing is the micro, your own little bubble in which you're existing. So the moment you're kind of exposed to high command, your mind is going to be filled with all the kind of a lot of the issues, problems, logistical headaches, all those kind of things, which as a junior officer, you're not expected to know about or not expected to kind of think too hard about. Suddenly there it is all on a plate. And that's going to inform you tactically on your tactical level. If you understand that, well, we talked about earlier on, that operational level on a kind of bigger and strategic level on a kind of bigger stage. So it can only help, can't it? And we all know that, when we have ideas about, historical theories about some of the research we've been doing, when we chat to a well-informed pal, it's really good to kind of, that helps you evolve your own thoughts, doesn't it? And presumably that's the same thing for him in a way. I mean, he's exposed to that and exposed to Peyton Marsh and that high-level stuff. And of course, that's going to be a massive help to him, isn't it?
Yeah, and I also think that when the 11th arrived into the Pacific Theater in May of 1944, one of the challenges that Swing had to overcome was this perception of, okay, well, you're an airborne division, you're understaffed, you don't have nearly as much firepower. You could also make the argument that his exposure to and comfort with speaking at the doctrinal level probably helped him, sell into, for lack of a better word, into MacArthur's staff to find a role for the 11th in some cases, particularly in the Luzon campaign. I think the Leyte campaign, they were probably more top of mind because they were there and there were so many heavy casualties in Leyte. I think that's why they were probably put in their role on that campaign. But certainly, when you see him working later so well with Eichelberger in the Luzon campaign, that certainly is reflective of a higher level of thinking, right, or exposure.
I compared Eichelberger and him to peanut butter and jelly. I mean, we always hear opposites attract. I think identicals attract, maybe even more. And so this is when the 11th Airborne is put ashore at Nasugbu, south of Manila, to kind of come at the capital from the south. And it's this really kind of dramatic lightning advance along a 67-mile road. And the other thing I wanted to address with you too, the composition of the division is different than the 82nd Airborne and 101st. There's 2 glider infantry regiments versus 1 parachute regiment, all that. So regardless, Swing has found a perfect partner in Eichelberger, and they have this incredibly well-managed battle there that I think is really overlooked. It's pretty dramatic, isn't it? This 60-some-odd mile push for southern Manila.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that, studying the 11th Airborne was fascinating because they don't get any of the benefit that the airborne divisions do in Europe. So to John, your point about, we see that, in the case of the 82nd or the 101st, before they go into Normandy, they're having additional regiments attached to them in order to kind of overcome some of those inherent size issues. Well, none of that happens in the 11th Airborne's case. They kind of go in with what they've got. And to your point about the Luzon campaign, you've literally got members of the headquarters staff, the finance guys, all carrying ammunition up that 60-mile corridor. And that goes back to Joe Swing's kind of perspective back in basic training, that everybody first and foremost was going to be a soldier in his division. You would have to find time to do your administrative stuff on your own. And that really paid off when, the running joke in the Luzon campaign at the headquarters was, we have our front is 400 yards wide and 60 miles deep. And that wasn't much of an exaggeration, really, as they were punching their way up into Manila. And, along with the Filipino guerrillas, it was really a case of all hands on deck. The division band was carrying ammunition, driving trucks up to get the supplies and keep those logistic trains moving.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly. See you in a moment. Just before we get to kind of, the detail of what they were doing on Luzon, can we just, I'm kind of really struck by what you said earlier on, James, about Swing coming at it from a different approach and training up his own division in his own way, having kind of learnt the pitfalls of airborne operations. Because one of the things that, we talk about a lot on this is, how the airborne arm developed from the Allied point of view and how kind of 1943 and 42, they're quite hard pills, and you've got this big problem that you've got these incredibly highly motivated men, pretty well trained, being delivered by possibly not the best aircrew in the world, and that's a problem, and getting these highly trained, highly motivated troops onto the right target is such a problem, and it's like everyone's thinking about the end game rather than the kind of sort of how to make it work. And also, the other point, of course, is that both the British and the Americans, their airborne arm just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It starts off quite small and quite, the ambitions are kind of quite modest and just sort of balloons and balloons and balloons. And, you look at Sicily, for example, hardly any, I think 200 troops land on the Piano Lupo or whatever it is, in the first drop. And it's not a complete disaster by any stretch of the imagination, because the guys that do get there kind of pretty much do what they need to do. And those who are spread to the four winds actually do achieve other things. So it's not a disaster. And even the only 4 British gliders that sort of land anywhere close to the landing zone manage to achieve what they need to achieve. But, 69 out of 144 gliders in the sea and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's an absolute catastrophe on every way you look at it. But Swing, of course, is involved in Husky. He's involved in the preparation of Husky. So what are those lessons? Because I still think, when it comes to the Second World War, people, the airborne drops that happen, the Allied airborne drops that happen, there's no perfect drop. There's nothing that kind of, there's always something that goes wrong or doesn't quite go as planned. You always feel that it's a kind of sort of airborne operations that are a constant sort of development, a work in progress. So, so what is it that Swing is bringing to the 11th Airborne that I don't know, Maxwell Taylor or Ridgway or I don't know, Windy Gale or whoever it might be is not bringing to those other airborne divisions?
Well, I think there's two ways to answer that. I think one is, Swing came back from Sicily with those lessons learned and was immediately put into the position, as John hinted at, around saving the airborne division concept, right? There was a lot of skepticism.
Yeah. So what is his big takeaway? What is Swing's big takeaway? Is it the inaccuracy of the dropping?
Yeah. So I think that's where the Knollwood maneuvers kind of come into play, which was this division size exercise that they seized, I want to say 5 small airfields in Nebraska. And that, had the benefit of, they tried as much as possible to replicate as complicated a flight plan as they had in Sicily. I think it was a 4 or 5 hour flight all told at night to bring in the division all at once. That went pretty successfully. When you look at the division level, though, the main thing that Swing brought back with him from Sicily as it directly impacted the 11th was a lot more training at night and a lot more emphasis on assembly of problems.
Right, but training with the aircrew that are delivering you to the combat zone.
That was right, and to a certain degree, though, that's somewhat out of his hands. I mean, that certainly was a lesson learned, I think.
Okay. But when you say training at night, what is that training?
Oh, sorry. A lot of night marches, a lot of night assembly problems, a lot of night assaults. And so it was interesting because, again, you see him going around to all his unit commanders at the time, and he's saying, hey, guys, we're doing these night problems. I don't want to see you training your guys doing stuff that you could do during the day, right? Because I don't want to waste these guys' time. We're going to combat soon. So these guys should have as much free time with their families as possible. So we are going to do a lot more night training, but it has to be stuff that benefits from the actual, cover of darkness type of stuff. So he wasn't, they weren't doing necessarily a lot of foot marches at night. They were doing a lot of assembly problems and a lot of, assaulting objectives and things like that, where the soldiers are starting to learn who's on their right, who's on their left, how to maneuver through the dark.
So it's sort of obvious basic stuff, really, isn't it? But so important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what's interesting is if you look at the airborne mindset, it's interesting to compare and contrast Swing's view of it with Orrin Haugen, who was the commander of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, who very much came up through the original kind of Army paratrooper perspective. He was a company commander in the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion, which was the U.S.'s first tactical group of paratroopers that were very much kind of viewed at the time as like we look at a Ranger battalion today, perhaps, right? They were independent units, battalion level, very much with this independent streak, kind of not real respectful of the rest of the Army's authority, so to speak, trained to specifically seize airfields, objectives. And so Haugen, who then came up through the ranks, worked for General Gavin for a period of time in the 505th, he kind of came at it as this band of elite warrior monks that he was training, versus Swing, who kind of looked at it as, like I said, just a unique way to kind of get to work. And where that mindset, you really see it come together is Swing started division level jump school while they were in Louisiana, with the idea that he wanted as many of the division trained to not only come in by glider but also come in by parachute, in order to kind of give him the flexibility of when he got to his battlefield, whether that be in Europe or the Pacific, to have the ability to deploy his troops as best as the situation warranted. And so he starts this division level jump school, puts Haugen in charge of it. Haugen starts running it just like the 4-week meat grinder at Fort Benning, with a heavy emphasis on physical fitness and hazing. Swing, tells him, no, you're going to run the jump school. It's going to be a 5-day long process. These guys have already been through basic training. They're already in shape. Gravity does most of the work. I just want you to give them the rudimentary skills they need to be comfortable jumping out of an airplane. Haugen refuses to do it that way, so Swing fires him from running the division level jump school.
Is that a fair enough call?
Oh, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'm freely admitting I'm a little biased. I'm a product of the Fort Benning model of jumping out of airplanes. I do think it's also fair to say that, gravity does most of the work when you're jumping out of a static line parachute. So I can see both sides of it.
But it sounds like Swing's a kind of slightly a man in a hurry. He wants to make sure that when his new division gets into combat, that they're ready. And so you've got to kind of make tough choices, because you've got to do the most important things. And it's all very well spending hours and hours and hours and weeks training and jumping out of aircraft. But if you then can't do what you need to do on the ground, then that's all for naught, isn't it?
That's right. And again, I think they had different perspectives. I would have, Haugen would have made the argument that he was preparing them for combat by making them better soldiers, by putting them through the toughest training that the Army had to offer, would have been Haugen's counter argument to Swing. And I think that was the argument that they had. And they infamously, or I should say famously, kind of literally came to a screaming argument over this in the middle of an officer's dinner. And then famously the next morning continued the screaming match in Swing's office. And so Haugen felt very strongly about the fact that the best way to get the division ready for combat was to put them through very difficult training.
And that's what's so amazing about it. I mean, they're totally butting heads here. They see it completely differently. And yet, Swing is not going to turn away from putting Haugen in place in the plum job as commander of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Works with him pretty well in combat. And Haugen is as true to his word, and that basically sacrifices his life on the concepts that he had trained on, right? I mean, he's right there in combat the entire time, and a pretty fiery leader. I just think that's amazing, because I think more like in the zero defect days, like around now, if a division commander is butting heads with one of his key operational subordinates, that guy's going to be gone. But not here, So why does Swing put up with him then?
I think John, I think that's a great point about the zero defect and kind of how we've kind of gotten away from the fact that you can disagree with each other but still have mutual respect on many levels. And I think that's kind of, it's regretful that Haugen, obviously it was regretful that he was killed in combat, but it was also, we kind of lose his side of the story post-war years, right? But it became very obvious that Swing started off with a very, we could say, skeptical view of jump school and paratroopers. But to your point, every time that the 11th went into combat, the 511th was in the vanguard of those campaigns. And I think there was a begrudging respect between those two. I think Haugen had to have seen Swing's flexibility, his very robust comfort level of how to run a division, how to keep things moving in combat. I mean, the 11th Airborne Division is not only into Manila, but then after Manila in southern Luzon is just a dizzying example of combat coordination. I mean, he's literally taking battalions and companies from each unit and moving them around to keep things moving and to keep the momentum going. And so I think at some point, Haugen had to recognize that, and also, later on understood what Swing was trying to do was not only give himself a high degree or higher percentage of well-trained men throughout the division, but also increasing the morale across the division, right? So let's not underestimate the challenges of those glider regiments and maintaining their morale. These guys were not volunteers. The vast majority of them had never been in an aircraft before. So now their first experience with flying is in a controlled crash in something that's covered in canvas. And so, Swing saw that opportunity there of like, okay, well, let's get these guys parachute qualified as well. He liked the morale that he saw within the parachute regiments, right? Or there's no doubting that those guys had an esprit de corps. So what better way to spread that across the entirety of your division? And at the apex of the division's jump school, you had 75% of the enlisted men were jump qualified, and 82% of the officers were jump qualified. And so, I'll throw this out as a challenging point to the We Have Ways audience, but it's I would make the argument that makes the 11th Airborne Division the most airborne of the airborne units in World War II. I mean, that's a incredibly high percentage of parachute trained soldiers, and it got to the point to where Swing actually redesignated the 187th and the 188th, renaming them paraglider infantry regiments as a way to designate their dual capability.
I think it all pays off in combat in the sense that this is really a superb light infantry unit. On Leyte, they're basically fighting. There isn't necessarily a front line. They're going hilltop to hilltop. They're being resupplied by air more than any other division on
Well,
Leyte.
that's also one of the natures of the consequences of fighting in that kind of terrain, isn't it? Mountainous, jungly.
But they fight this way more so than like the 7th Infantry Division or the 96 or any of the other units involved in the Leyte battle. I think in a way because they come from an airborne background and they're used to being maybe behind enemy lines or whatever. But in this case, it's remarkably similar to what Merrill's Marauders are doing in 1944 in terms of light infantry on deep penetration combat being resupplied by air. On Luzon, now they become this sort of maneuver unit. You have one parachute drop at Tagaytay Ridge, which is not intense combat or anything, but is important. And as you said, James, I mean, they're going to be involved in all these kind of hopscotch operations on southern Luzon, plus urban combat in the southern reaches of Manila. And, oh, by the way, a rescue operation, the Los Baños, camp. And I mean, so to me, whatever the training was, it certainly pays off in terms of the effectiveness of the unit for a lot of different kinds of missions.
Yeah, and you really see, going back to the light infantry, which I think is dead on, you see Swing using that unique airborne capability of literally dropping in a platoon of combat engineers and then a company of his paragliders jump in one at a time from the back seat of a light observation aircraft, right? So again, you see that his kind of comfort with changing doctrine is necessary in order to sustain the momentum of his campaign. I mean, these guys are literally puttering over the jungle, jumping out of these single engine aircraft. They'd wrapped their static lines around the back seat of the plane to jump in.
I mean, God, of all the places, I mean, when you're flying over Ronville or you're flying over, I don't know, some of the drop zones in where the 101st and 82nd are, it might be at night, you might be under fire, but at least there's sort of huge, great fields in which to drop. I mean, it's a slightly different kettle of fish, isn't it, than the Philippines?
Yeah, absolutely. The drop zone on Leyte was extremely small. That's why Swing dropped in a platoon of combat engineers initially to expand the size of that. And then eventually they managed to get their hands on a lone C-47 and dropped in a battery of 75 millimeter howitzers. So 4 75 millimeter howitzers up in the mountains there, which really helped. Because again, I think, going back to that idea of when you learn about the 11th Airborne campaign, it's really stripped down. And so, when those guys go up into the mountains of Leyte, they're really taking on the Japanese, toe to toe, because they don't have the luxury of close air support. They don't have the luxury of calling in heavy artillery from the coast for a combination of reasons. predominantly because their maps were so horrible. They literally had hand-drawn maps of the mountains in Leyte, which were missing entire ridge lines. But then those ridge lines and those hilltops were often covered in low clouds. And so calling in close air support wasn't really an option. And as you can imagine, you really want to know where you are on a map before you start calling in heavy artillery. And so that just was very difficult for them to do. So a lot of their fighting up in those mountains was, as John said, light infantry with, at the best, 81 millimeter mortar in support.
But that kind of, I suppose you'd call that asymmetrical warfare, that kind of type of fighting, that requires really good squad, platoon, company commanders who really are prepared. Everyone needs to be just completely, the traditional view of the bog standard Allied platoon is, that 6 men do all the work and everyone else just follows and tries to keep their head down. There's less room for that in the 11th Airborne or the 511th when they're operating in those sort of circumstances. So you really do need to be good. And I guess that comes all the way down from the top, doesn't it? But is Swing able to kind of, obviously Haugen's the bee's knees, but even though they have that huge disagreement, but are the unit commanders in the 511th and elsewhere in the 11th Airborne, are they top notch? And is that down to Swing, or is that just he lucks out, or is it a combination of the two?
I think it's a combination of the two, but I'll speak specifically to the 511th just because I think there's some ready examples there. I think, Haugen in his and
they're the kind of spearhead, aren't they, of the division, let's face it.
They're kind of the spearhead, exactly. And, in Haugen's West Point yearbook, his peers made note that he was really anti-discipline. And I think that they got it slightly wrong. I think he was anti-pedantic discipline, but he was very big on field discipline. And, one of the things that he picked up kind of along the way, particularly from his time in the 501st, was that parachute officers were all expected to lead by example and from the front. And Haugen's big thing with all of his junior officers was, while they were at Toccoa and then later at Benning in Louisiana, their whole thing was, now is the time for you to earn your men's respect. Once we get into combat, it's too late. They have to trust you and they have to respect you in training before you actually get committed to, in a situation where bullets are flying, because if you wait till then, it's too late. And so I think that's where you see, so the 511th ran up the famous Mount Currahee while they were at Toccoa, just like Easy Company did. And one of the platoon commanders in the 511th was famous for running up Currahee backwards so that he could keep an eye on his men while they were running. That little bit of, you see it in Patton, right? That little bit of showboat is a critical component of leadership in many cases, right? And same thing with Haugen. So I think there was a lot of emphasis on leadership, and you can also, compliment Swing on that as well, because again, he was the one that was going through and making sure that all his officers were out in the field training instead of, hiding back in the barracks, as the case may be, to make sure that those guys were out there leading.
Yeah, and even though he has this kind of falling out of Haugen in terms of jump school, Haugen's still commander of the 511th, so he's not like he's firing him. He's just saying, I don't want you to do the jump school bit anymore. But
that's right.
That reflects pretty well, I think, on Joe Swing, doesn't it? Because, a lot of people, when they have that kind of bust up, that's it. The subordinate is toast and sent off to a completely different division. I don't want to see you ever again. We don't see eye to eye. But that's not the case. He goes on and has this, he's an inspirational leader. He's known as Hard Rock, isn't he? And he's kind of, my impression is he's much loved by his men, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right. I think it is credit to Swing that he was able to see the long game over the short game of recognizing a personality conflict over one topic wasn't going to negate, Haugen's contribution. Haugen had a great reputation amongst his men. A perfect example is when the Angels got their nickname because of as a sarcastic reference to their often unangelic behavior. But if we look at the example in in New Guinea, before they were committed to combat, some of the men had stolen from down on the docks a shipment of beef, and it had managed to make it back to the division, and then had managed to make it only into the officers' mess tent. And Haugen famously stood up and yelled at all the officers in the mess tent that, I don't care if you steal, but if you don't steal enough for everybody, we're not going to eat better than the men. And so that just kind of shows his attitude. And of course, those, that came through in the way he treated the men, and they had a tremendous respect for his perspective. Now, again, the Hard Rock nickname, I think it's fair to say that some, not everybody is beloved, right? So he was strict, he loved to do rucksack marches or foot marches, as they were called back then, which, most people hate. so, I'm sure he had his detractors, but overall, I think he definitely walked the talk when it came to how to lead a parachute infantry regiment in combat.
Well, I think what makes the book special is this really great convergence of scholarship, of personal story. I mean, there's all these soldiers who come to life, from private, obviously, all the way up to swing. It's not a division history where it's like, okay, this unit went there, that unit went here, and, just sort of like dry as dirt kind of thing. But it's also not just this kind of, we're going to rely on ladder your oral histories to try and tell you the story and gloss over all sorts of facts. So, James, I wonder, in the aftermath of the book's publication, I imagine it's been an eye-opener for a lot of folks who are really airborne acolytes, and we've got that. I mean, I often joke that there's so much interest in Band of Brothers and Easy Company that it seems as though we won the war in Europe with one airborne company, and I think these guys, especially, I mean, if the 82nd Airborne is lost in that mock, can you imagine these guys? And so I kind of wonder what you've heard from readers and other folks about your 11th Airborne story, and whether there was many interesting comments along those lines from people who had been sort of obsessed with the Easy Company. Yeah,
I've been fortunate to hear from several of the families of veterans who, whose grandfather or dad had hinted at, his experience during the 11th Airborne. So it's always gratifying to hear from those folks who mention how, I got an email the other day from a dad and his son, who would be the grandson of the veteran, how this has kind of revitalized, an interest in their family history. And I think that's fantastic. From the other perspective of it, I was recently at Fort Liberty, which used to be Fort Bragg, for an event. And it was interesting how many folks there, kind of the home of the Airborne, you could argue, with the 82nd and 18th Airborne Corps being there. How many comments I got about folks not knowing about the 11th Airborne Division, and in some cases not even knowing that we had airborne units in the Pacific. So, that's gratifying to hear from a different perspective, because that's obviously also part of my mission is to tell those forgotten stories. And so it's helpful to know that that's getting out there. And then, as you know, the 11th Airborne was recently reconstituted up in Alaska. So now the Army has two airborne divisions, in theory, the 82nd and the 11th up in Alaska. And so I'm hoping that, they're doing a good job of kind of instilling the history.
The 101st is still there, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's air assault. It's not traditional airborne.
That's right. Strictly speaking, they're air assault division, although they still have the tab. But
I think it's fascinating. We spend so much time kind of talking about kind of the pioneering aspect of airborne operations in the war. And it's interesting. I just think it's so fascinating that you've got this only American airborne division kind of operating in the Far East in the war against Japan, and just doing things slightly differently and coming at it from a different approach. And yet that different approach is obviously partly drawn by the different scenario, but it's also drawn from the same early experiences of airborne operations in the war that the European airborne divisions are coming from. I mean, because Swing's there until post Husky, so he's got the same grounding as Ridgway and Maxwell in many ways, and the others, and McAuliffe and et al., who are operating in Northwest Europe after Husky. And I just think that's so interesting that he's coming at it from this sort of slightly different tack, and yet he's given that leash to do his own thing and form this division, create it, and train it in the way that he feels is best. And so, although they're all connected in so much that they're all airborne divisions, the 11th Airborne really does stand out, doesn't it? Different.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of comparing the use of airborne strategically versus taking a capability and understanding how you can use it tactically to keep your division on the move. In a lot of ways, you could make a good argument that kind of foreshadows how some of the units in Vietnam fought, right? Using helicopters to bring supplies forward. In the case of Swing, he's relying on a lot of airdrops, a lot of light observation aircraft to bring his troops forward, to bring his wounded out. That was another critical component of the 11th Airborne Division's campaign was, you're up in the middle of nowhere. How do you get your wounded guys out. He actually dropped in. He had trained a surgical team on New Guinea in airborne, how to parachute, drops those guys into the middle of the jungle to kind of set up trauma care as close to the front as possible. And then, uses his engineers to hack out an airfield in order to kind of fly those guys out once they've been stabilized. And so it's, obviously I have a perspective on it after having studied it and written about it, but I do find it just a fascinating campaign.
Well, and the other thing too, and this is so Army, I think, is that there's another airborne unit in theater, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, that actually is the one that makes the Corregidor drop, and had made the NADZAB drop, so they got there before the 11th Airborne. And you would think, like, from our perspective as just outside people years later, so, we'll just put the 503rd into the 11th Airborne, and they need a Parachute Infantry Regiment anyway. That never happens, and neither side really wanted anything to do with the other. So what was up with that? Why was that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because you're right. That was kind of the European solution, was let's take these independent regiments and attach them either permanently or semi-permanently to the division to kind of make up for those numbers. That did not happen with the 503rd and the 11th Airborne Division. I have not really been able to get conclusively down to any documentation about why that didn't happen, other than, Colonel Jones, who was in charge of the 503rd, didn't want it to happen. I can suspect that part of the reason why it didn't happen was that Swing was adamant that when they ultimately did get another regiment, this was between the time of when they were on Luzon, largely after the island had been more or less secured, and the time that they flew into Okinawa and then subsequently air landed in Japan. They did send another parachute unit over from the United States, and Swing immediately took that unit, split it up, and used it to populate the rest of his division. Because from his perspective, hey, unlike some of the European units that broke up their glider regiments to kind of do the same thing from a TO&E change, Swing was like, nope, you guys have fought through 2 campaigns, you've earned your battle streamers. I'm not taking a new unit and keeping them intact. I'm going to split them up so that I can keep the original unit designations within my division as a standing component of the division. And so that might have been part of the hesitancy of the 503rd. They knew that they wouldn't be the 503rd much longer. Yeah.
They would have fought that under the death.
That's right.
Absolutely. And the other interesting thing, James, I think that Colonel Jones, George Jones, would have butted heads with Haugen big time, because if there was one thing Jones believed, it was that, like you said, this is just a way to commute into work, this whole airborne thing. It's not who we are and our identity always, and we don't do it always. So like in the Corregidor operation, his first battalion goes in there and whatever, but he's very happy to land his subsequent reserve battalion by sea rather than send them into this troubled drop zone that's going to lead to a lot of jump injuries. Haugen would have been like, the hell with that, we're jumping, that's who we are.
Right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, it's a good point. Just as an interesting historical anecdote as an aside, the 503rd had lost a lot of their parachutes over their time in the Pacific. And so for the jump on Corregidor, they actually had to borrow parachutes from the 11th Airborne Division in order to get enough to make the drop.
And that's about as close as they want to get with each other, I guess.
That's right. I think that's right.
Yeah, well, we talked about the Corregidor drop a couple of months ago, didn't we? And that's it's an amazing operation. It really is. But what the 11th Airborne do is, it's so impressive, particularly when you consider the terrain, the difficulties, the kind of, the bugs, the lurgies, all the kind of, the privations that you have to suffer. I mean, I know it's the same for both sides, but it's overcoming that, isn't it? It's overcoming your enemy, and i.e. the Japanese, but it's also kind of overcoming the kind of enemy that is the terrain and in which we're operating, which is obviously kind of sort of a big point in the book, isn't it? But James, while we got you, I'd love to know your take on, just as an airborne man yourself, Market Garden. Doomed to fail, worth the punt. Yeah, I just can't let that go, I'm afraid. My own view is you got an airborne army, probably wasn't going to work, but it might have worked. You've got lots of motivated men twiddling their thumbs in England. It's for better or for worse, there is an Allied airborne army. You might as well use it, and it might just work. There's lots of, the Dam Busters looks like the Dams Raid, for example, that always looks like on paper, that's doomed to fail, and yet it doesn't. So, sometimes you got to take a punt on things.
That's absolutely right. And I think it was part of the maturing doctrine as to how they were going to use those divisions. So I think that it definitely falls within the scope of the original intention of how they were building out division level airborne assets. But I'll throw this controversial, perhaps, perspective out about my main man, Jim Gavin. And I know that there's been some back and forth around his responsibility with seizing the bridge.
Take the heights or focus on the bridge.
Making.
That's right. So one of the first things I learned as a 18-year-old private in the Army is you can delegate authority, but you cannot delegate responsibility. And so, when you hear the argument about Jim Gavin, if Browning is his boss and Gavin goes to Browning and says, hey, I want to secure these heights before I secure this bridge, and Browning says, go for it, well, that's an example of authority versus responsibility, right? It's still Browning's responsibility as the Corps commander to figure out what is the primary objectives and responsibilities of his units on the ground. And so I'll throw that out as a counterpoint to some of the more recent perspectives on Gavin.
Well, I think that's a very valid point. And don't forget that Browning hasn't seen that much action. He hasn't seen as much action as Gavin. So, yeah, I think Browning going in is himself and taking up 21 aircraft or whatever it is with his Corps headquarters is one of the failings of Market Garden in my book. I mean, I just don't think he should have gone. And, I can understand why he was itching to do it. But your personal itch that you need to scratch is not really what it's about. It's about the bigger picture stuff.
Well, and I think, if you look at Market Garden as a foreshadowing of Varsity and the lessons learned in Varsity, I think one of the things, and I know John is a fan of Ridgway as well as I, when Ridgway decided to go across into Varsity, he did not jump. He did not take extraneous aircraft. He crossed, amphibiously and brought his airborne headquarters with him from that way, as opposed to, taking up extra aircraft that, of course, as we all know, there was no such thing as extra aircraft in World War II, right?
Just like there were no extra landing craft.
That's right.
Premium on all of it, that for sure.
Fair point.
Yeah.
Never had enough. It was a problem for both sides, though, wasn't it? I mean, the Germans never had enough certainly never had enough transport aircraft, that's for sure. Oh, well, listen, this is fascinating. We're a little bit obsessed about airborne operations on this podcast. I know Al will be a little bit sore to have missed out on this conversation. So James, please come back on again. I would love to have you on and talk about the crossing of the Rhine. But I think, I think we should also, next year is obviously the 80th anniversary, but let's have a meaty chat on Market Garden. Come on.
Let's do it.
I mean, we've been quite restrained on Market Garden this year. So,
we have, because I think we're, building up our ammo for next year.
We're definitely building up ammo for next year.
It's like a coiled spring.
Oh man, yeah, absolutely. Well, James, listen, thank you so much for coming on. It's been brilliant to have your perspectives and just so endlessly fascinating. And if anyone wants to learn more, first book that you get, Angels Against the Sun. It's cracking, all about the 11th Airborne, and it's a terrific read and a terrific piece of research and a terrific addition to the genre, frankly, and to the subject, the bigger, wider subject. Not just the Second World War, but also, what's going on in the Far East and the Pacific War against Japan. I mean, Philippines is just so interesting, isn't it? I mean, yep. I've become really obsessed about the whole thing. I really have.
You and me both.
Anyway, thank you all for listening. Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks to John. And see you all very soon. Cheerio.
See ya.
Bye-bye.